may not have watched Joe Dante's 1981 film The Howling, but you know what? Its sequel, a comic book called Revenge of the Werewolf Queen, is an exceptional piece of work that doesn't quite require you to have watched the movie. It combines exceptional writing, stunning artwork, and faithful character development to create a story that will leave you hungry and thirsty for more. I agree that horror film adaptations in comics can be hit or miss, but this 8-issue comic proves to be exceptional. It revitalizes the franchise by returning to the tone and genuine horror that made Joe Dante's original film iconic. So without further ado, let's cut to the chase and find out who the Werewolf Queen is, what she wants, and how she becomes the matriarch of the Shapeshifters. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Issue 1. The comic does well to start almost where the movie ended. We find ourselves witnessing a news broadcast presented by Karen White. She goes, "A secret society exists and is living among all of us. Tonight, I'm going to show you something to make you believe." And with these words, Karen begins her transformation into a werewolf. You see, in the 1981 movie, she had become a victim to a werewolf bite and was turned into one. She had managed to meet her colleague and friend, Chris Halloran. Chris had destroyed the colony where these werewolves lived, and they returned to their homes in Los Angeles. She broadcast worldwide to inform people around the globe about the existence of werewolves. However, as soon as she begins to transform, Chris shoots her with a silver bullet, effectively killing her. This was 3 weeks ago, and now Chris can't shake off the fact that he killed his friend on live TV, even though it was Karen's idea after the events at the colony to change in front of everyone to reveal the curse and to be freed from it. When he told the authorities what he did and why he did it, the prosecution figured he was angling for an insanity defense. Only problem was that the entire team saw the same thing. By the time the cops showed up, Karen's body had turned back to normal. Well, that's how werewolf bodies work. Don't you watch movies? And the investigators were still trying to puzzle out what happened. But Karen was not the only woman he had lost. He had also lost his girlfriend, Terry, another victim of serial killer come werewolf, Eddie Quist, aka Eddie the Mangler. Chris gives us a bit more of the backstory before moving on, and we learn that Karen had been working with the cops to link Eddie to a string of serial killings, and the KDHB News was covering the story. Terry was program assistant, while Chris was the producer. Anyway, Karen managed to get the cops to Eddie, and he was shot dead. But Eddie came back, much like the other werewolves, much like Dr. George Wagner, who would send the werewolves to his colony, where they were expected to feed on cattle, etc., and live a life that was not violent or riddled with crime. Nearly every night was the same for Chris. He just couldn't get enough sleep, as the past would haunt him. He was watching Annie Sterling on KDHB News, but his mind was wandering around what happened with Terry and Karen. The cops had found 8 bodies at the colony. However, there were 20 of Wagner's so-called patients there when he had stormed the place. In fact, there could have been more. He thought he burned most of them in the barn, but he seemed to be wrong because the murders in the city did not stop. It was now that he received a call from Lou Landers, an anchor from KDHB News. Landers was supposed to be up at the news, but he called in sick, which is why Miss Sterling was the one anchoring. In reality, Landers was just thinking about George Fowler, the sports guy for KDHB News. Something had happened to him while he was driving his Camaro, but the cops found liquor bottles in the car. Chris and Landers decided to meet at Landers' place to drink and catch up. But more importantly, Chris wanted to brief Landers about whatever he knew. You know, about Karen and whatever transpired the day she died on live TV. Chris reached Landers' home, but couldn't believe what he saw. Landers had seemingly shot himself, blew his brains out with a shotgun. At least, that's what it looked like. There was still quite a possibility that the whole scene was staged. The next panel takes us to a lavish Santa Cruz home. Time, 1 in the morning. The lady of the house, Vera, enters, only to find Miss Marcia there. Just to jog your memory, Marcia is the seductress from the movie, the only werewolf we know for sure who survived. She was holding a book called The Gift, written by George Wagner. Yep, the same guy. Anyway, the book was in Vera's library, so she was definitely interested in Wagner in one way or another. Marcia went on about Wagner for quite a while, telling Vera how she disapproved of Wagner's ways. But Vera was not quite interested, you know? And that made sense because she had some strange woman in a skimpy outfit sitting in the house. Vera thought Marcia was doing her husband and straight up asked Marcia the same, to which Marcia said, "Not right now. Right now I'm getting to know you, Vera." When asked what she did, Vera said that she dealt in antiquities for a living, but that wasn't exactly the truth, and Marcia was aware of her truth. The first issue ends here, but Marcia Quist established herself as a good villain, someone who exudes a sense of terror in the most evil way possible. Let's jump into the next one. Issue 2. This one starts exactly where the last one left off. Marcia was still in Vera's house, who was now in the process of pulling a gun on Marcia, and the conversation was still about Vera's job profile. Marcia tells Vera that she knows about the crooked things Vera does. She says, "I'm not a big city person, but the way I understand it, you introduce people, buyers and sellers, except what they buy and sell is on the black market." Listening to this, Vera loses her shit entirely and points the gun at Marcia, who obviously seemed not bothered by it. Vera shouts for someone named Kurt and threatens Marcia. "Get out of my house now! Get out or I swear to God!" However, Kurt does not appear. Not yet. Marcia, on the other hand, taunts Vera. "Swear all you want. God's not listening. Pull the trigger." Vera obliges, and boom! A bullet dashes out of Vera's revolver and hits Marcia, who bleeds, but nothing happens to her. Of course, Vera was left shocked and horrified. Marcia slaps the revolver out of Vera's hand and gets down to business. She says, "Years ago, you arranged a sale, a relic called the Hand of Akara. Who bought it?" Vera does not put up a defense and quickly tells Marcia that the relic of Akara had been bought by one Joe Valentine, the CEO of Primacore. As soon as Marcia got the information, she started to transform into her werewolf form. I believe the appearance of Marcia in the middle of the transformation was more horrific than her final werewolf form. Kudos to the artist. Oh, and I told you that Kurt didn't show up, right? Well, Marcia confirms to Vera that he's already dead. As Marcia's transformation reaches its final form, Vera makes a run for her life, but she's escaping the deadly claws of a werewolf. How far could she possibly go? Vera runs through the streets, hoping to find just about anyone, but to no avail. It was past 1 o'clock in the morning, and not a soul was in sight for Vera to get help from. She runs and runs, knocks on doors, but no one opens. Dr. Wagner has talked about not denying the beast, and yet he wanted the werewolves to live among humans, blend in, feed on cattle. He wanted them to channel their energies in positive directions, but that was not happening. Marcia had given in to her primal instinct. She was chasing Vera through the streets, not outrightly killing her, although she could do that any moment she wanted to. Finally, a werewolf did catch up to Vera, but it did not seem to be Marcia. You see, this guy was wearing a pair of pants, torn to bits because of the transformation, and Marcia was wearing a black dress. Nevertheless, another werewolf arrives at the scene and slashes Vera's neck out of her body. The head flew away, and as it thumped on the ground, a simple truth became more and more established. What is it? Well, you cannot tame what is meant to be wild. And that's where Chapter 2 wraps up, setting the stage for a thrilling third issue where Marcia would go on her hunt for this relic. But several questions remain. Why does she want it? What will she do after she gets it? What are its powers? Let's find out. Issue 3. First things first, the third issue begins with a gorgeous image of Marcia Quist, the vengeful werewolf queen in a skimpy outfit. I mean, yeah, her face is a blend of a wolf and a human, but man, the rest of her? And the blood-laden blade just makes the whole thing really badass. Moving on, Marcia follows an employee of Primacore from his office to his home, and surprises him while he's swimming. Of course, the man wasn't just surprised, he was defenseless. Yet, being in a high-paying corporate position gives you a degree of confidence. He asks Marcia, "Did you escape some institution or something? Forget to take your meds?" Marcia does not seem affected by the insult and asks him how to find his boss, Joe Valentine. His answer began with a good old, "Listen, you dumbass." But his tone kind of changed when Marcia grabbed, squeezed, and held on to his wet balls with her werewolf hand. After that, he didn't waste a moment to tell her that Joe Valentine would be visiting this trendy nightclub called Kismet the following day. As soon as she got the information, Marcia ripped off the pillar and stones right out of their resting place. The employee screamed in pain, but it was time for the two of them to bid goodbye. And that was the end of this rich but unfortunate employee, whose biggest mistake was working for Primacore. The next panel then reverts to Chris, and we learn a few things about what was going on with his colleagues. So you remember the sports guy Fowler? Well, he had apparently gotten drunk and drove off a cliff, and we saw how Lou put a 12 gauge in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Now here's the thing. Before Lou killed himself, he called Chris to talk about Jean, and that doesn't sound like suicidal behavior, right? Moreover, on the phone, Lou sounded more afraid than sad. Secondly, no one knew Jean to be a heavy drinker, so it became apparent to Chris that there was more to these deaths than what meets the eye. He had nowhere to go and nobody to talk to, so he went to his employer, hoping that the man would have some sort of advice. Chris knew that it was a long shot, but he had to do something. He could not just sit out there, waiting for another body to fall. Chris asks the old man, Fred, if he had heard about Lou. Of course he had. Fred also tells Chris that they were gonna do a retrospective piece on Lou and Jean, pulling all the stops. Chris addresses his concerns, all the unanswered questions about the deaths of his colleague. However, Fred simply discards everything. So much so that he doesn't want to believe that people who saw Karen change were being targeted and he could be next. But you know what? Chris also got the idea that Fred sounded scared. It was quite possible that the bad guys had already gotten to him, threatening him or his family. Few men are able to hold their own against such threats. And it would have made sense for Fred to simply stay out of the whole thing. Before leaving, Fred tells Chris to leave him alone or else he'd be compelled to get a restraining order. Well, so much for that long shot. Later that day, Chris learned about Mr. and Mrs. West. She was decapitated, and they didn't give the cause of his death. Of course, we're talking about Vera and Kurt West. This makes Chris wonder, maybe he didn't put down all of the wolves at Dr. Wagner's colony. Could the Santa Cruz killings be one of them? Well, he was on point, he just didn't know it yet. Chris's investigative instincts kick in, and he calls the morgue that housed the corpses of Vera and Kurt. He introduces himself as Bill Jenkins from KDHB News, who was apparently working on the West killings, and just needed to straighten out his fact. The voice on the other end said, "I'm just the attendant. TV people talk to the coroner." Well, fair point. But Chris makes a desperate attempt to get what he needs. So he tells the attendant that they were going to go on air later that week, and he just needed to confirm if the Wests died because of an animal attack. The attendant confirms that Kurt's throat was ripped out. You can imagine it was something like what happened to the crotch of that Primacore guy. And although Vera was found decapitated, it didn't seem like a machete-wielding man or woman did it. The cut was too rough to have been carried out from a blade. This other long shot paid off for Chris, finally. He then rings his lawyer, Harry Cording. Harry informs Chris that Karen's last broadcast, the master tapes of which he had subpoenaed KDHB for, were gone. Poof. But that's it. Harry didn't even finish the conversation and hung up the phone abruptly, saying that he had to run. He too sounded afraid, much like Lou. Next, Chris goes to a pawn shop and sells the ring he had bought for Terry. The best he could do now was honor her memory. Deep down he knew that she would understand. These were his thoughts when he used the money from selling the ring to buy himself a gun. He then went to a bookstore that dealt in subjects that would be off limits for Hogwarts third-year students. This guy gave Chris everything he had on shapeshifters. He takes the books, orders some more silver bullets, and leaves the place. Just as he walks out of the shop, he gets stumbled upon by a woman, and the books fall. As she gets on her knees to help him, she tells him that he's being watched. Every second, every move. She then slides a note into one of the books and asks him to follow the instructions written on the note if he wants to prove everything. Chris thought to himself that maybe his luck was changing now. Maybe Terry was up there, looking out for him. Or was Chris going to fall into a trap? Well, only the next issue will answer that. Issue 4. The fourth chapter of this thrilling story begins at the Kismet Club, where the Primacore employee had said Valentine would be. The conversation begins with Valentine telling Marcia that she moved fast, to which Marcia says, "When I know what I want, I take it." Of course, the poor horny guy who had placed his hand on her butt thought she was talking about him, but she was only after the relic. She suggests they go somewhere else, get to know each other better. But Valentine tells her that going home was out of the question because there was a Mrs. Valentine waiting at home who thought he was working late. Then she suggests they go to his office and he could show her his fancy desk. Get to know her better on top of it. Needless to say, he fell for it. As he unbuttoned himself, Marcia looked at his collection of antiques. She tells him that she was a collector as well and was looking for a relic, the Hand of Akara. Valentine was shocked to hear it. Common folk wouldn't even know the name of this relic, and here was Marcia telling him that she was looking for it. In fact, she tells him that she knew he bought the said relic from the black market. Before he could ask her to shut the heck up, she takes a katana from his collection and strikes it on his thigh. She was just making a point. She gives Valentine a choice: talk or have the sword in your thigh twisted. Valentine does not argue any longer and agrees to give her what she needs. But Marcia hears a couple of cops approaching them and is prepared to face them when they appear a few moments later. Needless to say, she kills them with extreme brutality. Valentine had taken the opportunity to try and kill Marcia with another weapon, but Marcia was Marcia. Not only did she hurt him some more, but she also pushed him through the window of his high-rise office. Marcia then finally gets her hand on what she had been wanting for so long, a severed hand of a werewolf, and it was now that we also learned about her plan. You see, true warfare is never really contained to violence. It stretches back further than what's written in books, to an age undreamt of, a dark era of shifter kings and queens and goddesses, a time when the earliest humans were nothing more than food for these violent shifters. Now, she wanted the cycle to begin again. She wanted to restore the natural order and resurrect that long-forgotten age. She wanted the shifters to rule over Earth again. Would she succeed? Also, how does this new woman, this surprise friend, fit into the picture? Is she really trying to help Chris? Or does she have an ulterior motive of her own? Issue 5. We are now officially in the second half of the comic, and it's gonna get more and more interesting from now on. Now, this one begins at quite an interesting place. At a Pornhub. Yeah, like there were these two chicks in their two pieces about to wrestle their tongues before removing their tops. Of course, there was a camera guy who was also the director, but Marcia crashes the party. One of the girls started thinking that this was going to be a three-way and demanded extra payment, but getting paid kind of means little when you're dead. Marcia sticks her claws into that girl's chest and rips off one of her rib cages. She kills the second one by sticking the bone up her throat, no puns intended. The camera guy thought he was hallucinating. He was blaming it on bad drugs, but Marcia assured him it was all real. He asked her what she wanted from him, to which she replied that in a few minutes she would need him to work that camera. Back to Chris. He called Fred, his boss, but he got the machine. He anyway says what he had to. Oh, and remember that he was just following the instructions given to him by that mysterious woman. He tells Fred's machine that he was in touch with Carol Cook from KHWP and was supposed to meet her at Motel Bella at 2 in the afternoon. Chris was offering Fred a chance to get an exclusive on the story for KDHB. After this, he went to the motel and waited. At around 1:30, he hears footsteps outside the room. It turns out the man who arrived was a government agent and was possibly the one who poured alcohol down Jean's head before making Lou suck on a shotgun. But the girl from earlier was hiding behind the door, waiting to strike. She hit the guest at the back of the head with a baseball bat and knocked him down before the two of them tied the man to a chair. A bit about the woman. Her name was Ruth, and although they didn't have much time to talk before the mystery guest arrived, she did tell him that she used to be an FBI agent. In fact, she was part of a department dedicated to prove or disprove the existence of shapeshifters. They collected signatured, written testimony, and they found people willing to testify before a committee that werewolves were real. And then, out of nowhere, her department got dissolved. All her work was confiscated, and she knew something bad was coming for her, so she went underground. Furthermore, she tells Chris that her old partner stayed on, and the two of them kept in touch. In fact, the partner guy, he made copies of everything. Ruth then leaves to meet the partner and asks Chris to stay put until she returns. Before leaving, she tells Chris that she will leave another set of notes at the bookstore for Chris to pick up. He still had to take care of this government agent. I mean, he couldn't keep a hostage inside a motel room forever, right? So he went on a jog down memory lane and came up with an idea. So back in the day, he worked on a project about a fringe government watchdog called the Free Radical. Of course, these guys hated the government, all the secrecy and dark things that came with it, and would do anything to bring out their dirty secrets. He made a few calls, and an hour later, another guy knocked on the door. This guy was from the Free Radicals. The deal was that he would take Chris's hostage in exchange for information that Chris had on the Freedom broadcast. With this man in the motel and a promise that Chris's problem would be taken care of at sundown, the latter left for the bookstore. Here, he received the note from the bookstore owner, but the contents of the note turned Chris pale. Issue 6. The note read, "I have Ruth. Eros, 6 p.m. Well, it was enough for Chris to lose his shit. The bookstore owner asks Chris about what happened, and the guy replies that it was about a friend. She was in grave danger. The bookstore owner couldn't do much to ease Chris, but for what it was worth, he did give him the silver bullets that Chris had previously requested. Determined to help his new ally, Chris left. At first, he thought that the government agents had gotten hold of Ruth, but Eros? Well, it had to mean something else, because Eros was the same porn shop that Eddie Quist lured Karen to, where he was shot by the police. He wondered what exactly he was walking into, but no point wondering because he was soon going to find out for himself. He entered the same booth that Karen had once entered and emptied a quarter into the slot and waited. It didn't take long for the movie to start, but wait, it was no regular porn. He was getting shocks after shocks. You see, he knew that Ruth was in danger, so he was somewhat mentally prepared for it, but what he was not prepared for was to see Marcia Quist standing right there before his eyes. She was Eddie's sister, and he believed she had perished in the fire he had set. Clearly, he was wrong. She tells him that she's gonna kill Ruth, and the only way to save her is to arrive at the colony later that night. And if he somehow decided to let another one of his friends die, she would kill Ruth, find him, and kill him also. So the dude didn't have much of a choice, but he couldn't let Ruth die. The guilt of her death would be too much for him to bear. He goes back to the hotel with a plan in his head. He offers to make a deal with the captured government agent. Following that, he left for the colony. Chris had no idea what was waiting for him back at the colony. More shapeshifters, most likely some kind of a trap. But he was determined to end everything that night. He was not going to put any more lives in danger, no matter what. So yeah, he arrived at the only structure still standing, Dr. Wagner's medical office. This was where Eddie had killed Terry before Chris killed Eddie. So yeah, a lot of memories, sad ones, resurfaced. But he braved them and opened the door of the cabin to find Ruth tied to a chair. He unties Ruth and ensures that she's all right. But something felt amiss. I mean, where the hell was Marcia? Why would she leave Ruth alone when she knew that Chris was on the way? Ruth heard the rotors of a chopper and asked Chris what it was. He called it Insurance Number 1. You see, he used his hostage to inform his colleagues about his capture and the whole thing about Marcia. But that's not all. He also called in the Free Radicals, telling them that the government was ready to hide another major story, a secret that affected the lives of everyone. And these guys, he called them Insurance Policy Number 2. Chris's plan was to make the two groups collide against each other so that he and Ruth could use the distraction to escape from the clutches of the werewolves. But wait, Ruth tells him that he should play a recording left for him by Marcia. Meanwhile, there was a standoff between the government forces and the Free Radical guys. On the other hand, a bunch of werewolves looked on from afar. We move to Marcia. You see, other than her, only a handful of the werewolves had survived the night Chris went on the werewolf massacre, and their numbers were hardly enough to make a difference right now, especially with all the guns that were present near Dr. Wagner's cabin. But that did not worry Marcia. So there's a long enduring legend of that long ago age when gods and goddesses walked among mortals. Then came a war. In this war, the werewolf queen named Akara led her armies against multitudes of humans. But before she could clench her final victory, she was betrayed by her own, and her armies were decimated. But Akara's goddess was a goddess of vengeance, and this goddess bestowed upon Akara a great power, the same power that now channeled through Marcia. She basically now had the power to awaken the dead werewolves. Werewolf zombies, if you will. Now, that's something you don't see every day. She calls to her fallen friends, and her calls get answered. Issue 7. Back to Chris and Ruth. He plays the recording and Marcia's voice goes, "Hello, Chris. So good of you to come save poor Ruth. I knew you would." Something about the psychology of guilt. Me? My psychology is simple. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This was the first time that Marcia explicitly mentioned what she wanted: revenge. Meanwhile, the free radicals and the government guys were still at each other's throats. While one side called the blaring chopper the sound of tyranny, suppression, and obfuscation, the other side demanded that weapons be dropped, none willing to budge. Amidst this chaos, one of the soldiers alerted his men about movement in the tree line. Meanwhile, Marcia's recording continued. She drops a bomb on Chris, something that we had our doubts about already. Marcia tells Chris that Ruth is not who she seems. In fact, her name is not even Ruth. She was Donna, a werewolf. Outside, werewolf zombies attacked the opposing factions. Blood spilled, bones cracked, people died, werewolves rejoiced. It turns out that Chris had previously shot Jerry, Donna's husband. She also knew about the government agents who had targeted Marcia and her brothers previously. As a journalist, he was taught to get the facts straight, to verify. Despite that, Chris believed Donna's lies, didn't care to cross-check if Donna, aka Ruth, was a former FBI agent or just some bloodthirsty monster looking for revenge. Outside, the werewolves continued their rampage, and the worst part for the humans was that even the silver bullets were not working any longer. It was a mess. A gory, elegant mess. But Chris managed to take Donna down. Issue 8. We are now at the final chapter of the story. A chopper opened fire on everyone below, targeting the werewolves, but one of them leapt on the chopper, killing its pilot. Of course, the bird came crashing down. One of the men standing on the ground got grounded into mincemeat because he came into the path of the chopper blades. The werewolves continued their rampage until every human soul was sent to hell or heaven. Marcia's heart sang, for the legends of the past were true. Her brothers and sisters were hunting again. They now existed in their purest form, devoid of all humanity. They were simply beasts, ready to hunt, kill, and run amok, trying to rule Earth. But here's the thing. One of the soldiers figured out a weakness. You see, although the silver bullets could not kill the werewolves, a headshot did the trick. So what happened was that the resurrected werewolves lost their supernatural abilities, and they were just powerful humanoid wolves who followed the command of the one who held the relic of Akara. Of course, the soldier who killed the last werewolf through the headshot was killed by Marcia. That girl is really big on revenge. And now, Chris was surrounded by all the werewolves led by Marcia. Needless to say, they ripped him to pieces. Marcia's vengeance was finally complete. It was now time that they made a home in the wild. Time that they now increased their numbers and built their strength. Time to prepare for a war against humanity itself. With Chris's head in one hand, the relic of Akara in the other, a crescent moon behind her, and her werewolf followers beneath her, Marcia Quist was ready to unleash her fury as the Werewolf Queen. And that's the end of this awesome comic. Marvelous verdict. This comic is worth your time. The Howling, Revenge of the Werewolf Queen, excels in its ability to stand alone, which makes it accessible whether you're familiar with the Howling franchise or not. While knowledge of the original 1980s film enhances the experience, the comic provides sufficient background to enjoy the story independently. The writing is commendable, delivering essential plot details without overwhelming readers with lengthy recaps. As Mickey Nielsen's debut comic, it captivates from the start, though its brevity leaves fans eager for more, especially after the gripping cliffhanger at the end of issue number 1. The artwork and coloring are the best features of The Howling, Revenge of the Werewolf Queen. Jason Johnson and Milan Parvanov masterfully blend realism with horror-inspired effects, effectively capturing the gore-filled essence of 80s horror. Their work complements the storyline and tone seamlessly, enhancing the overall reading experience. The comic distinguishes itself with 4 unique covers: a Blu-ray-inspired cover by Yvel Guichet and Carlos Eduardo, a movie poster cover by Anton Kokorev, a painted Werewolf Queen cover by Yvel Guichet, and a final werewolf cover by Bill Sienkiewicz. Each cover, despite its distinct style, aligns perfectly with the interior content, maintaining the comic's intended atmosphere. Space Goat, the team behind the entertaining Evil Dead 2 comics, delivers a direct sequel to the original Howling after 7 on-screen follow-ups. This sequel honors the original by providing a refresher on the film's ending, where Karen White's werewolf transformation was dismissed as a hoax known only to the survivors, particularly Chris Halloran, who killed Karen at her request. The comic serves as both an epilogue to the movie and a setup for future stories, as Chris begins to suspect other survivors from the fire at the colony. It explores the untapped potential of the central female villain, Marcia, drawing inspiration from Gary Brandner's Howling 2 novel, but carving its own unique path. The comic captures the classic Rob Bottin werewolf designs, ensuring visual continuity with the film. The characters remain true to their original portrayals, with their motivations evolving naturally and the story expanding into a fitting comic book arc. Fans of Joe Dante's The Howling will find delight in this new sequel. It offers dynamic, moody artwork that preserves character integrity without rigidly replicating their appearances. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.